Good evening. It is a quiet hour, and the world outside is settled into a comfortable dark. Come closer. The records I keep here in the archive are not always of grand events or historical figures. Sometimes, the most profound stories are filed away in the silence of an ordinary home, hidden behind a front door like any other on a street you might have driven down 1,000 times. The file we are opening tonight is one such record. It concerns a mother, a daughter, and a series of transactions on a credit card statement. A simple domestic drama, you might think. But the numbers printed in black ink on that thin, unassuming paper were a language of their own, spelling out a story of betrayal that was, in fact, something else entirely. A story that, once deciphered, would shatter a mother's world not with anger, but with a love so fierce and unexpected, it would bring her to her knees. Claire was a woman forged in the crucible of single motherhood. Her life was a carefully constructed fortress built of routine and vigilance. She woke at 5:30 every morning, the pre-dawn quiet her only time for herself. In that blue-gray stillness, she would sit at her small kitchen table, the linoleum cool beneath her bare feet, and map out the day. She was a cartographer of survival, charting a course through school runs, a demanding job as a paralegal, and the endless, thankless tasks that kept her small world from spinning into chaos. Her love for her daughter, 16-year-old Emma, was the sun her world orbited, a source of immense warmth and, lately, a disquieting gravity. Emma was in that liminal teenage space, no longer a child who would crawl into her lap for comfort, but not yet a woman who could meet her gaze as an equal. She was a universe of closed doors and muffled music, of monosyllabic answers and a digital life lived through the glowing screen of her phone, a life Claire felt increasingly locked out of. The discovery began, as most modern calamities do, with an email. A simple, automated notification from her credit card company. Your monthly statement is now available. Usually, Claire would give it a cursory glance, her eyes scanning for the familiar villains, the grocery bill, the gas station charges, the monthly subscription for a streaming service they barely used. She knew her budget down to the last cent. There were no margins for error, no room for indulgence. But this time, as she scrolled through the PDF, a cold knot began to tighten in her stomach. The numbers were wrong. They were alarmingly, impossibly wrong. There, nestled between the mundane charges, were anomalies, intruders. The first was a food delivery service she'd never used, an expensive one that specialized in artisanal gourmet meals, $112. Then another, from the same place a week later, $98. A charge from a high-end florist, Blooms and Briar, for $75. Who was Emma receiving flowers from? Or worse, who was she sending them to? Claire's mind, a finely tuned instrument for worst-case scenarios, began to race. Was there a boy? A secret romance she was funding with her mother's hard-earned money? The anger was a slow burn, a familiar heat rising in her chest. She worked 60 hours a week. She packed her own lunch to save money. She hadn't bought a new coat in 3 years. The thought of her daughter carelessly squandering that sacrifice on expensive takeout and flowers was a physical blow. But it was the last charge that truly stole the air from her lungs. It was the largest, a recurring payment of $500, listed under a sterile, corporate-sounding name, MedPay Services. It was a name that meant nothing and everything. It was opaque, clinical, and utterly terrifying. $500. It was more than their weekly grocery budget. It was a phantom limb on her financial statement, an expenditure she couldn't account for, a gaping wound in their carefully managed finances. She looked at the date. The first payment had been made a month ago, the second just last week. A pattern, a secret, a deliberate act of deceit. And in that moment, all the small, unsettling changes in Emma's behavior over the past few weeks coalesced into a single, ugly portrait. Her quietness was no longer teenage moodiness. It was guilt. Her time spent locked in her room wasn't a need for privacy. It was concealment. The way she avoided Claire's eyes wasn't shyness. It was the practiced evasion of a liar. The fortress Claire had built around their lives had been breached, not by an outside force, but by an enemy within. Her own daughter. The anger that had been simmering now boiled over, hot and bitter. She printed the statement, the pages emerging from the machine warm, like damning evidence fresh from the scene of the crime. She laid them on the kitchen table, a declaration of war, and waited for Emma to come home from school. The silence that greeted Emma when she walked through the door was heavier than any argument. It was a thick, suffocating blanket of parental disapproval. Claire was sitting at the kitchen table, her posture rigid, her hands folded on the surface as if she were in a legal deposition. The printed statements were laid out before her, a stark white accusation against the dark wood of the table. Emma dropped her backpack by the door, the thud echoing in the tense quiet. She looked at her mother's face, a mask of cold fury she hadn't seen since she was a child and had broken a cherished family heirloom. "What's wrong?" Emma asked, her voice small, already sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Claire didn't answer immediately. She simply gestured with her chin towards the chair opposite her. Emma approached cautiously, her eyes darting from her mother's stony expression to the papers on the table. She sat, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "I want you to explain these," Claire said, her voice dangerously calm. She slid the first page across the table. "Let's start with the small things. $200 on food delivery, $75 on flowers. Are you living a life I'm not aware of, Emma? Do you have a secret benefactor? Or have you simply decided that my money is your personal entertainment fund?" Emma stared at the paper, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "What? I didn't order any of this. I don't even know what Blooms and Briar is." "Don't you lie to me," Claire snapped, her composure cracking. The words were sharp, each one a shard of glass. "It's your name on the delivery account, your details. Do you think I'm a fool? Do you think I wouldn't find out? Mom, I swear I didn't." Emma's voice trembled. She looked utterly lost, a swimmer caught in a current she didn't understand. Claire's heart, for a moment, felt a flicker of doubt. The confusion in her daughter's eyes looked so real, but then the anger, the feeling of betrayal, rushed back in and extinguished it. She had been too soft. She had given her daughter too much freedom, too much trust, and this was the result. She pushed the second page across the table, the one with the highlighted charge. "And this, Emma? Explain this. $500 to a company called MedPay Services, and another $500 the month before. What is that? An online shopping addiction? A video game you're secretly playing? What could you possibly need $1,000 for?" Claire watched her daughter's face, expecting a confession, a cascade of tears, an admission of guilt. Instead, she saw something that stopped her cold. The color drained from Emma's face. Her eyes, fixed on the name MedPay Services, widened with a terror so profound it seemed to hollow her out from the inside. It wasn't the look of a teenager caught spending money. It was the look of someone whose most vital, most protected secret had just been exposed to the harsh light of day. Her breath hitched. A single choked sob escaped her lips. "Emma?" Claire's anger was momentarily forgotten, replaced by a surge of alarm. "What is it? What's wrong?" But Emma couldn't speak. She shook her head, a frantic, desperate motion. The tears that had been welling in her eyes now streamed down her face, silent and heavy. She looked at her mother, her expression a maelstrom of fear, grief, and something Claire couldn't name. A sorrow that seemed far too old for a 16-year-old's shoulders. Before Claire could say another word, Emma pushed her chair back violently, the legs scraping against the floor. She turned and ran, not to her room, but out the front door, slamming it shut behind her. Claire was left in the echoing silence of the kitchen. The printed statements lay on the table, the black and white figures seeming to mock her. The confrontation had explained nothing. It had only deepened the mystery, replacing her anger with a cold, creeping dread. Her daughter hadn't looked guilty. She had looked broken, and Claire had no idea why. The fortress had not just been breached. Its very foundations were cracking, and she was standing alone in the ruins, watching the dust settle. The next morning, the silence in the house was a living entity. Emma hadn't come home. A string of frantic texts had gone unanswered. Claire had called her daughter's friends, their sleepy, confused voices offering no clues. She had spent the night pacing the floors, her anger completely evaporated, replaced by the icy grip of parental fear. Every shadow in the corner of her eye was the shape of her daughter. Every passing car on the street was her return. But the night had offered no solace, only the endless ticking of the clock, each second a small hammer blow against her heart. Exhausted and running on pure adrenaline, she knew she couldn't just wait. She needed to do something, anything. The credit card statement on the table was the only tangible clue she had. She had to unravel this mystery, not for the money anymore, but for her daughter. She drove to the bank, the familiar streets of her neighborhood feeling alien, as if she were seeing them through a distorted lens. The world was going on as normal, people walking their dogs, sprinklers chattering on manicured lawns, while her own world had been turned inside out. Inside the bank, the air was cool and smelled of recycled paper and faint disinfectant. She sat before a customer service representative, a young man with a polite, practiced smile. She explained the situation, trying to keep her voice steady, framing it as a case of potential fraud. She slid the statement across the polished desk, her finger trembling slightly as she pointed to the charge from MedPay Services. The young man typed into his keyboard, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Okay, I see the charges here, Mrs. Evans. They are legitimate transactions, not flagged as fraudulent. They were made online using the correct security code." "I understand that," Claire said, her frustration mounting. "But who are they? What is this company?" "Let me see what I can find," he said, his fingers flying across the keys again. He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes scanning the screen. "The merchant name is an umbrella payment processor. It's used by various healthcare providers. Let me check the sub-merchant information. Here it is. The payments were directed to an institution called Home Care Hospice." The words hung in the air between them. Home Care Hospice. A hospice. A place for the dying. Claire stared at him, her mind struggling to process the information. It made no sense. It was a piece from a completely different puzzle. Why would Emma, her vibrant, healthy 16-year-old daughter, be sending $1,000 to a hospice? The fear that had been a cold knot in her stomach now tightened into a vice of pure terror. Was Emma sick? Was she hiding some terrible diagnosis from her? The thought was so monstrous, so unbearable, that she felt her vision begin to tunnel. "Ma'am, are you all right?" the bank representative asked, his voice laced with concern. Claire blinked, forcing herself back to the present. "Yes, I'm fine. Can you give me the address?" He wrote it down on a slip of paper and pushed it towards her. The address was on the other side of town, in a quiet, older neighborhood filled with large oak trees and houses that had stood for a century. As she drove, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white, a new narrative began to form in her mind, each possibility more terrifying than the last. Was this some elaborate, misguided charity? Had she been scammed by a friend with a sick relative? Or was it the unthinkable? Was this money for Emma herself? She replayed the scene from the night before, her daughter's terrified, heartbroken face. It wasn't the face of a girl caught in a lie. It was the face of a girl guarding a secret that was tearing her apart. Home Care Hospice was not what she had expected. It wasn't a sterile, grim hospital building. It was a large, converted Victorian house, painted a soft buttercup yellow, with a wide, welcoming porch and beautifully kept gardens. It looked like a home. There was a quiet dignity to the place, a sense of peace that seemed at odds with the turmoil raging inside her. She parked the car but couldn't bring herself to get out immediately. She sat there, the engine ticking as it cooled, staring at the front door. Whatever truth lay behind that door, she knew it would change everything. Taking a deep breath, a breath that felt like drawing in shards of glass, she opened the car door and walked up the stone path to face it. The interior of the hospice was filled with soft light and the gentle scent of lavender and old wood. A kind-faced woman with silver hair sat at a reception desk in the foyer. She looked up and smiled at Claire, a warm, genuine smile that did little to soothe the frantic beating of Claire's heart. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft. Claire's own voice was a hoarse whisper. I'm not sure. This is going to sound very strange. I'm looking for some information. My daughter, her name is Emma Evans. I believe she may have been involved with this place somehow." The receptionist's smile widened with recognition. "Oh, Emma, of course. She's such a sweet girl. Are you her mother? It's so lovely to finally meet you. She speaks of you often." Claire felt a wave of dizziness. They knew her. They knew Emma. This was real. "She's been here?" "Many times," the woman confirmed. "She's been an absolute angel. A true blessing for one of our residents, Mr. Bailey. Thomas Bailey." The name meant nothing to Claire. Bailey. She searched her memory. A Rolodex of neighbors, friends, colleagues. Nothing. "I'm sorry. I don't know a Thomas Bailey." "Oh, well, he used to be your neighbor." "Dear," the receptionist said, her tone gentle. "Years ago. The little brick house at the very end of your street. He lived there for over 50 years. A very quiet man, kept to himself after his wife passed. And then a memory surfaced, faint, distant like a photograph faded by the sun. An old man, stooped and gray, who would be out in his yard meticulously tending to his rose bushes. He rarely spoke, offering only a brief, shy nod if you caught his eye. Mr. Bailey. He had moved away a few years ago, the house sold to a young family. Claire had barely registered his absence. But Emma had been younger then. She had been a curious, talkative child. Claire suddenly recalled small, forgotten moments. Emma, as a 9-year-old, picking dandelions and solemnly presenting them to the old man over his fence. Emma, sitting on her front steps, watching him work in his garden for hours. Claire had seen it as a fleeting childhood fascination, a small kindness. She had never imagined it was the seed of something so much deeper. "Mr. Bailey is here?" Claire asked, the pieces beginning to click into place with a horrifying slowness. The receptionist's expression softened with sympathy. "He is. Thomas is one of our long-term residents. He came to us a few months ago. He has pancreatic cancer. I'm afraid it's very advanced." The world tilted on its axis. Pancreatic cancer. Her old neighbor. Emma. $1,000. "I still don't understand," Claire stammered, her mind refusing to make the final, impossible leap. "What does this have to do with my daughter?" "Well," the receptionist began, leaning forward slightly, her voice dropping to a confidential murmur. "It's a difficult situation. Mr. Bailey has no living family, no savings to speak of. His insurance ran out months ago. He was set to be transferred to a state-run facility. A clean place, certainly, but impersonal. Not a place one would wish to spend their final days. Your daughter, Emma, she found out somehow. I'm not sure how, but she came here one afternoon, about 2 months ago. A quiet, determined little thing. She sat right where you are now and asked what it would cost to keep him here." The receptionist paused, as if she herself still couldn't quite believe the story she was telling. "We explained the costs for his room, his palliative care, his medication. It's substantial." And she just nodded. She said she would handle it. And she did. She set up a payment plan, using a credit card, I believe. And she didn't just pay Mrs. Evans, she came to visit him 3, sometimes 4 times a week after school. She would bring him food. His favorite, she said, from a little Italian place he liked. She brought him flowers, lilies, for his late wife, Eleanor. She would sit with him for hours, reading to him from old paperback novels when his eyes got too weak. Sometimes they wouldn't even talk. She would just sit there holding his hand so he wouldn't be alone. Every word was a nail being driven into Claire's heart. The food deliveries, the flowers, the $500 payments to MedPay services. It wasn't carelessness. It wasn't deceit. It wasn't teenage rebellion. It was a covert operation of staggering compassion. It was a secret act of radical kindness. Her daughter, her quiet, withdrawn daughter, had been shouldering a burden that would have crushed most adults. She had been single-handedly ensuring a dying man could end his life with dignity and comfort, surrounded by lilies and the quiet company of a friend. Claire thought of the confrontation in the kitchen, her cold, accusatory tone, the look of utter devastation on Emma's face when she realized her secret was out. Not because she was caught, but because her beautiful, selfless act had been twisted into something ugly and selfish. She hadn't run out of guilt. She had run out of heartbreak. Can I see him?" Claire asked, her voice thick with unshed tears. The receptionist's kind face was etched with sorrow. "Oh, my dear, I'm so sorry. You just missed him. Thomas passed away peacefully, early this morning. Your Emma was with him. She held his hand until the very end. The fortress Claire had built, the one she thought was protecting her daughter, had been a prison all along, a prison of her own making, of her own assumptions and fears. And now, the walls had crumbled to dust, and she was standing in the wreckage, finally seeing her daughter for the warrior she truly was. The tears she had been holding back finally came, a silent, scalding torrent of guilt, of pride, of a love so profound it felt like it would break her in two. Claire drove home in a daze, the world outside her car a watercolor blur of greens and grays. The grief she felt for a man she barely knew was tangled up with the immense, aching pride she felt for her daughter. And beneath it all, a chasm of shame had opened up. She had stood in judgment of Emma, armed with the flimsy evidence of a credit card statement, while her daughter was out in the world, performing an act of grace so pure it was almost holy. She had been worried about paying bills while her daughter was tending to a dying soul. The sheer magnitude of her failure as a mother, as a witness to her own child's life, was a physical weight pressing down on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. When she pulled into the driveway, she saw Emma's bedroom light was on. She had come home. For a long time, Claire just sat in the car, her hand on the ignition key, trying to assemble the right words. But there were no right words. An apology felt insultingly small. An explanation felt like an excuse. All she had was the raw, open wound of her regret and the fierce, protective love that was now mixed with a new, humbling sense of awe. She found Emma sitting on her bed, her knees drawn up to her chest, staring at the wall. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, but she was no longer crying. She looked hollowed out, exhausted by a grief too heavy for her young shoulders. She didn't look up when Claire entered the room. The air between them was thick with unspoken things, with the ghosts of last night's accusations and the weight of this morning's truth. Claire didn't speak. She walked over to the bed and simply sat down beside her daughter. Not touching, not yet. Just sharing the space, sharing the silence. Minutes passed. The only sound was the hum of the house around them. It was a silence that was more intimate than any conversation. It was an admission of failure, a plea for forgiveness, a testament to a bond that had been fractured but not broken. Finally, Emma spoke, her voice raspy and low, not looking at her mother. "He's gone." "I know," Claire whispered. "I went to the hospice. They told me." Another long silence. Emma finally turned her head, her gaze meeting her mother's. In her eyes, Claire saw not anger or resentment, but a deep, weary sadness. "Why didn't you tell me, sweetie?" Claire asked, her voice breaking. "Why did you carry all of that alone?" Emma shrugged, a small, tired gesture. "I knew you'd worry about the money. We don't have extra. I heard you on the phone with the bank last month. I knew things were tight, and I didn't want you to say no. He couldn't go to that other place, Mom. He was so scared. He told me it was like a waiting room with no windows. He just wanted to stay in his room with the view of the garden. He said the lilies reminded him of Eleanor." Her voice cracked on the name. "I couldn't let him go there. I couldn't." Claire felt the last of her defenses crumble. Her daughter had protected her from the burden, just as she had protected Mr. Bailey. In her fierce, quiet way, she had been taking care of everyone. "The money doesn't matter." "Emma," Claire said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. "We'll figure it out. We always do. What matters is what you did. It was the most beautiful, most honorable thing I have ever seen." She finally reached out, her hand covering her daughter's. Emma's fingers were cold. She curled them around her mother's, her grip surprisingly strong. "I'm so sorry," Claire whispered, the tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry for what I said, for what I thought. I didn't see you. I really didn't see you." Emma leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, a gesture from a childhood not so long ago. A quiet sob shook her frame. "I just didn't want him to be alone," she whispered into the fabric of her mother's shirt. "Nobody should have to be alone at the end." Claire wrapped her arms around her daughter, holding her tightly, as if she could absorb some of her pain, some of her impossible strength. She rocked her gently, her own tears soaking into Emma's hair. In the quiet of that room, with the afternoon light fading outside the window, a mother saw her daughter for the first time, not as a child to be managed and protected, but as a woman of profound character and quiet courage. And in that moment of devastating clarity, Claire felt a love that was deeper and more absolute than any she had ever known. She was proud, she was heartbroken, and she was forever changed. The weeks that followed were a time of quiet healing. A new kind of silence settled in the house, one born not of secrets, but of shared understanding. They talked more, not about the big things, but about the small ones. They found their way back to each other, step by careful step. The debt on the credit card remained, a significant but no longer monstrous figure. Claire took on extra work, and Emma got a weekend job at a local bookstore, insisting she helps pay it off. It was their burden to share now, and somehow, that made it lighter. One Saturday, a few months later, Claire found herself driving back to the buttercup yellow house with the wide porch. She had called ahead. She walked through the now familiar front door, the scent of lavender welcoming her like an old friend. She had come to volunteer. It felt like the only right thing to do, a way to honor the man she never knew and the daughter who had taught her the meaning of compassion. She spent the day reading to a woman with fading eyesight, her voice filling the quiet room with stories of faraway lands. She refilled water glasses and fluffed pillows. She listened. More than anything, she just listened, offering the simple, profound gift of her presence. As her shift was ending, she was walking down a long, sunlit hallway, and she noticed a wall covered in photographs. It was a memorial wall, filled with the smiling faces of residents who had passed through these doors. And there, in the center, was a picture of Thomas Bailey. He was younger in the photo, a twinkle in his eye, a gentle smile on his lips. He was standing in a garden, surrounded by lilies. Beside the photo was a small engraved brass plaque. Claire leaned in to read the words. It did not say his name or the dates of his life. It simply said, "For those who remember others." She stood there for a long time, her fingers tracing the cool metal of the plaque. It was a memorial to him, yes, but it felt like something more. It was an epitaph for a quiet kindness, a testament to a secret act of love that had rippled out, touching and changing the lives of others. It was a tribute to her daughter. In the end, the most important transactions in our lives are never recorded on a bank statement. They are the debts of kindness we owe to one another, the quiet investments of the heart that pay dividends in ways we can never truly measure. The ledgers of the human heart are often written in an invisible ink, legible only in the light of true understanding. Claire and Emma's story is a reminder that what we perceive as betrayal can sometimes be a shield, protecting a kindness too fragile or too profound to be exposed. The archive is filled with such records, tales of quiet heroes and their secret battles. We must learn to look past the surface of things, to read the language of actions, not just words, and to have the grace to admit when we have been wrong. The most valuable truths are often the ones that break our hearts before they can begin to heal them. Thank you for spending your time with me in the archive tonight. The hour grows late, and there are many more files to attend to. I hope you will join me again when another story is ready to be told. Until then, be well.